I would always go for legislation as the very last resort. And I would think it would be more effective to go for engagement and working with the platforms to see what can be done quickly and effectively.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Shanmugam?
Thank you, Dr. Nimmo. When you are the United States, I suppose you can talk to them. You can understand that maybe other countries, when they talk to these large internet platforms, what if they say no to you, to a country like Singapore? What do we do?
That's when you can start thinking about legislation. Within the territory of Singapore, you are the legislators, you can do that.
Right.
But in terms of flexibility and speed of response, as a first instance, it's much quicker to be able to, to have, let's say, okay, it's not going to be a red telephone these days, but to have a dedicated contact system whereby in severe cases, you can reach directly to them, whether it be through a branch office in Singapore or a regional branch office.
Right.
That will depend on the setup of each company. But to have some system in place for quick contact, if they then don't appear to respond, then you can say, well, actually, on the territory of Singapore, we're the guys who write the laws. And if necessary, we will and can go down the legislative track. But it's much better not to.
Understand.
Also because in terms of the problem with the internet is that if, let's say, if the video was posted from Singapore, then that's your jurisdiction. If it's posted anywhere else, it's outside your jurisdiction.
Yes.
And it's as soon as you're talking international cooperation to deal with this, it's going to be very slow. So again, having a direct line to the platforms, which is not based on the cudgel of legislation, but based on something more deft and more flexible and more based on cooperation, is probably going to be a quicker response.
Right. Let's look at it this way. On the one side is the problem. There are attackers. We have talked about them without talking about which country. Sophisticated. They attack institutions. They attack ethnic groups, racial groups. They exploit anything that can be exploited to weaken a country and weaken a country's resolve. And there could also be people within the country, some of whom who could do the same for a number of reasons which you have talked about. And society itself is under threat. I think none of this is controversial. You have seen all of this. It can happen, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now we talk about responses to this situation. One way of approaching it is to say, okay, what is our objective? And I think which approach you take is really a question of philosophy. A balance to be struck between somebody's right to set out and propagate falsehoods on the one hand, because that's what we are talking about. We are not talking about free speech. We are talking about a right to use thousands of bots, to retweet, to shape opinion using technology and falsehoods. So it's not, we are not talking about democracy, we are not talking about free speech, we are talking about the very antithesis of free speech. So a right to pursue that kind of behavior balanced against a society's right to protect itself and make sure that there is peace, harmony. Right? So that's how I would put the two concepts. And I think it's a question of which philosophy you prefer. I can understand your perspective that even in that situation, you would rather say the right to do all these things should not be curtailed through legislation. If people want to do that, they can do that. And you try and work with the internet companies to try and stop it. That's your philosophy, right? I mean, that's how I see it.
Okay, I would not actually characterize my philosophy that way, because we've been talking about false information, but as we've seen, it's very seldom that a piece of let's call it disinformation, is 100% false. If you think even in the Lisa case, the initial reporting from the Russian state outlets was factual. They were saying that here is a girl who is saying that she was abducted and raped. The girl was saying that. She was lying, and it became evident fairly quickly that she was lying, and nevertheless the Russian state outlets ran with it. But at the start, there was a grain of fact in their reporting. And what we see in an awful lot of the falsehoods which are going around online is that they have some core of fact in there, and that makes it extremely difficult to define what is hyper-partisan, what is unbalanced, what is incorrect, what is deliberately false. And in terms of legislating on this, as with any legislation, your definitions are absolutely crucial.
Yes.
But a lot of the work I do on a daily basis is dealing with disinformation and what people call fake news. The working definition I have of disinformation is deliberately spreading false information.
Right.
And I very much like your term, deliberate online falsehood.
Right.
But the problem is, even to use that term disinformation, therefore, means that I have to be able to prove both that the information was false and that it was deliberate.
Right.
That's actually quite a high evidentiary bar to prove that the likelihood is that this person is telling this story knowing that it is false. And there are a very large number of stories where it's a grey area. You can't tell, is the person deliberately making this up, or are they amplifying something they've seen as something else? And then, as Professor Lemonnier was saying, in the case of, for example, the Russian propaganda outlets, they don't often commit outright falsehood. What they will do much more often is they will interview somebody who has inflammatory viewpoints and just let the person talk. They won't even need to ask leading questions because the person is so engaged in their story that they will do it anyway. Now, that is not falsehood. It's biased, it's unprofessional, it's not proper journalism, but it's not false. And so if you are thinking of crafting a law which tells the platforms you have to take down false information immediately when we tell you, well, how are you defining the problem? Are you only looking at false information? That's probably 1% of the problem. Are you looking at information which is mostly false but has a grain of truth in it? That's where it gets problematic. What if the story is 5% true? Is it still a false story? Is it deliberate? What if somebody's citing another website? Are they then doing that deliberately knowing it's false? Or there are so many grey areas here in terms of the spectrum from a story which is 100% made up to a story which is 50% made up to a story which isn't made up at all, but you're only interviewing people from one side of the debate. That your legislation is just the preamble to your legislation is going to be the size of the Oxford English Dictionary.
Well, let's look at the Lisa case.
Concern.
Let's look at the Lisa case.
Yes.
Do you think there was any basis for you say the Russian media, let's stick to the Russian media, continuing to put out a story where the German police have concluded that there was no basis for it, to allow an attack on the German police and effectively undermine people's confidence in the police as an institution in another country through a variety of state channels as well as online channels? Do you think there is a basis for that? And don't you think it is right for Germany or any other country to say, I will not allow it?
I think it's right for. I think the later stages of the Russian reporting were a deliberate attack, and they were intended to inflame. However, the way, if you like, they achieved their effect by leaving things out rather than putting things in.
Right.
So they would interview angry ethnic Russians on the streets of Berlin who were saying, this is terrible and the police were covering it up.
Yes, but
now, unless you can prove that angry ethnic Russian is an
there is a continuum, because they kept repeating that there was a rape of a young girl by Middle Easterners, and then managed to inflame people, and then continue with the consequences of that by going around interviewing others. That's where I'm suggesting to you that a state has every right to stop it early on. And I think, I mean, it's a matter of values, but I think it's entirely justified for a state to intervene and say, this is not allowed. But I can understand if you say no, you take a different view.
Again, the problem is on what grounds you're doing that, because you're absolutely right. They take the story, they take the lie that this girl has told, they report it, that inflames real people, then they go and interview those inflamed real people. The problem is that they are not giving, they're giving equal weight to an angry anonymous Russian on the street and the Berlin prosecutor's office.
Yes.
Now that's a violation of journalistic standards, but it's not. They're not paying actors to do this. They're interviewing real people, and if you like, the important thing is the real people that they're not interviewing. So that would be a case in which there's actually a good precedent, which is the Ofcom, the telecoms regulator in the UK, which is responsible for all kinds of broadcast standards. And that includes the standards, the obligation to preserve due accuracy and due impartiality.
Yes.
Now, due is an important consideration, but I think that if you're going for the legislative track, then that might be a good approach to emulate. Right. That if you say the Russian stories were not technically false, but they were, I think, violations of due impartiality, because they gave all this airtime to angry Russians. So if you can phrase it in that way, and if you can say the standards are due accuracy and due impartiality, right, and that's a violation of the standards, then I think that would be a way in which you could practically find an actionable response. If your legislation is going to be based on saying, well, that's false and you can't do it, false is an insufficiently defined term. But if you're going to look at the terms of due accuracy and due impartiality, then that gives you a more solid footing, and it gives you better criteria to determine where the boundaries are.
What has been suggested to us yesterday by somebody else, a professor of law, is that, for example, there are different ways of approaching it. One is you think that there should be a counter to the story, and you don't ask for that to be taken down. You ask them to carry some clarification, which is an alternate view. For example, every time you tweet that the girl has been raped, you've got to also add in that the German police say that this is untrue, and then leave it to the readers to judge for themselves. For example, that's a possibility. But you can only do that through legislation. And so there is no censorship in that sense, but leave it to the readers to judge. The other possibility which was suggested was when it's clearly false, and I think I beg to differ with you in this sense that there are items where it is completely manufactured and totally untrue, which is legally very easily identifiable. And you ask for it to be taken down, but you give an opportunity to the other side to then come and perhaps deal with at a neutral tribunal that in fact it is not false. I mean, these are things that one has got to think through, but I understand where you're coming from. And I think that will give you a better sense that legislation may not necessarily just be one solution. There might have to be different solutions for slightly differentiated outcomes.
I think that makes sense. And if you have the more nuance you build in, or the more acceptance of nuance you build in, the better. For example, if you can prove that a video which purports to be of a riot in Singapore today was actually filmed in Catalonia 10 years ago, then you've got a very solid case for saying that that is 100% false. And once you have something which is 100% false and can only have been done deliberately, then you have a much stronger basis on which to act.
Yes.
I think the idea of obliging people to carry the other side of the story is quite interesting, and actually dovetails with the idea of due impartiality, because in the case of the UK, the idea of due impartiality is that you have to give adequate space to significant voices. It doesn't have to be a 50-50 split, but somewhere in your report, let's say if you are commenting on a criminal case happening in Berlin, then it is legitimate to argue that the point of view of the Berlin prosecutor's office is a significant voice. And if you are leaving out that voice entirely, you've just violated journalistic standards. So, and you're not doing your job properly. So at that point, if you're going to have legislation which says you must have due impartiality, and if you're not going to do it, then the legislators have the right to say that this was not duly impartial and therefore it needs to include this particular voice, then that is a way forward. The one caveat I would throw in there is that for Ofcom, it normally takes between 2 and about 6 months for them to come to a decision on a particular story.
Yes.
So you need to be able to find a way of making this operational in real time rather than sometime next year.
Thank you very much.
And you're welcome.